All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into the incredible and honestly kind of surprising story of how the Constitution for the world's largest democracy came to be. And it's a journey that doesn't start where you'd expect, not with revolutionaries or grand philosophers, but with something else entirely.
So let's just jump right in with the big question, right? How on earth did a private trading company manage to lay the legal foundation for the world's largest democracy? I mean, it sounds pretty wild, but believe it or not, that's a huge piece of this puzzle.
Okay, so to really get this, we've got to rewind to the very beginning. The East India Company, they didn't show up in India with armies and some grand plan for conquest. Nope. They arrived with ships, spices, and a laser focus on making money. But, as you'll see, that commercial mission slowly, and then very quickly, morphed into a political.
Just take a look at this timeline. We're talking about a huge span of time here. The company rolls up in 1600 just as traders, but then fast forward to 1765 and bam, they get Diwani rights. Now this is the absolute game changer. It's the power to collect taxes and run the civil justice system. This is the moment a corporation starts acting like a government, and this whole setup pretty much continues until the big revolt in 1857, which forces the British Crown to step in and take direct control, right up until independence.
So as the company's power just exploded, you can bet that alarms started ringing back in London. The British Parliament suddenly realized this rogue corporation needed to be brought to heel. So they started passing a whole series of acts. And the funny thing is, their goal wasn't to grant freedom. It was to control their own creation. But in doing so, they kind of accidentally started building the framework for a modern state.
And this right here is the first really crucial piece of the puzzle. The Regulating Act of 1773. This was a massive deal. For the first time ever, the British government officially stepped in to manage the company's business. It was them saying, okay, you're not just a company anymore, you're a political power. And with that, they laid the very first bricks for centralized administration in India.
Then, about a decade later, you get Pitt's India Act, which set up this really interesting system they call double government. Basically, they split things up. The company's directors, they could keep managing the money, the commercial side of things. But a new board of control, appointed by the government, now had the final word on everything else, all the political, civil, and military stuff. You can really feel the crown tightening its grip.
And listen to this quote from the act because it's so telling. The company's territories in India were for the first time called the British possessions in India. Just think about that. It's no longer just the company's land, it's now officially British possessions. The language itself tells you everything you need to know about the shift from a business to an empire.
And you can see this relentless push towards centralizing power. It happened in stages. First, in 1773, the governor of Bengal gets a promotion. He becomes the governor general, and the other presidencies now have to answer to him. Then, 60 years later, in 1833, another upgrade. The Governor-General of Bengal becomes the Governor-General of India, with exclusive power to make laws for all of British India. One single supreme authority was now calling all the shots.
And then 1857 happened. The Great Revolt. I mean, this event absolutely shook the British Empire to its core. It was a massive turning point, and it spelled the end for the East India Company. The era of a company running a country was over. It was time for a whole new system, with the British Crown taking the reins directly. The Government of India Act of 1858 basically made it official. It just completely tore down the old structure. The company? Gone. Abolished. All its powers were transferred straight to the British Crown. The title Governor-General was changed to Viceroy, making him the Queen's personal representative. And back in London, a brand new cabinet post was created, the Secretary of State for India, just to oversee the whole operation. Now, after the shock of the 1857 revolt, the British had a realization. They couldn't govern India alone, not without at least some local buy-in. This kicked off a long, slow, and, let's be honest, very calculated process of letting Indians participate in government. But, and this is a big but, this path also introduced some policies that would prove to be deeply, deeply divisive.
And here it is, the very first tiny step. The Indian Councils Act of 1861. This law let the Viceroy nominate a few Indians to his legislative council. Now let's be clear, this wasn't about democracy, not at all. But it was a huge recognition that Indian voices, even in a very limited way, had to be part of the conversation when making laws for India.
So how many people are we talking about?
Well, the Central Legislative Council started out really small. The number of non-official members was bumped up to just 16. 16 people for a territory that vast.
But then came the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, and that number jumped all the way to 60. So a pretty big expansion, right? Well, yes, but it came with a very controversial catch.
And that catch was something called the separate electorate. It's a hugely controversial idea. As you see here, it was a system where Muslim members of the council would be elected only by Muslim voters. In effect, the act legalized communalism. It created political divisions based on religion, a move that earned Lord Minto the unfortunate title Father of Communal Electorate.
By 1917, you can see the official language was starting to change. This declaration from the British government clearly stated that the goal was now the gradual development of self-government institutions, all with an eye towards the progressive realization of responsible government in India. This really set the stage for the next big piece of legislation, one that tried to put this new principle into practice.
And that practice was a system they called diarchy, which was rolled out in 1919. It was a pretty complicated experiment in sharing power. Here's how it worked. Provincial government subjects were split into two piles. You had transferred subjects, things like health and education, and these were handled by Indian ministers. But then you had the reserved subjects, the really important stuff like finance, police, law and order, and those were kept firmly in the hands of the British governor. It was an awkward and ultimately unsuccessful system, for sure, but it was another step on that long road.
Okay, so this brings us to the final phase. This is the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of acts, reforms, and experiments. This last major law passed by the British would become the direct blueprint for the future constitution of an independent India.
We're talking about the Government of India Act of 1935. This thing was a monster, a lengthy, incredibly detailed document. And this is really the core idea of our whole explainer today. This act provided the very scaffolding, the administrative and legal structure that the framers of the Indian Constitution would later take, adapt, and build upon. It was almost a pragmatic choice. Why reinvent the wheel when the basic machinery of a modern state was already sitting right there?
And this is where the connection just becomes crystal clear. It's almost a one-to-one mapping. The 1935 Act proposed an all-India federation. The Constitution created a federal system of government. The Act divided powers into 3 lists. The Constitution has the exact same 3 lists in its 7th schedule. The Act's idea of provincial autonomy, that became our state governments. The federal court became the Supreme Court of India. The public service commissions became the UPSC and state PSCs. The constitutional DNA is it's undeniable.
So we end up right back where we started, with a big question. Was this whole 200-year process the practical, step-by-step creation of a blueprint for modern governance? Or was it simply the unavoidable inheritance of a colonial past, a framework that an independent India had no choice but to adopt and reshape for its own future? The answer, well, like history itself, is wonderfully complex.